Just a quick note before we get started today. If you've been enjoying How to Be an Artist and you'd like to support it, please feel free to review it and leave a rating on iTunes. Share it, and of course you can support How to Be an Artist by going to patreon.com/H2BNA. Thanks, and on with the show. How to Be an Artist. Step 17. The Wilderness of the Mind. With guest Tim Farrington.
Maybe the first thing I had to do is, you might have noticed if you were, I know you commented on it, so you probably did see my little report. Kind of recently, I have had some like more difficult, more challenging experiences. I had like some panic attacks that I talked about, which are kind of,
I was interested in that.
Yeah, which is kind of unusual for me. I don't think I've really had anything like that for a long time. And especially recently, I've kind of been almost on a year-long high after a big meditation experience. And then this is the first thing I've had that's like, wow, this is kind of scary. And so, I talked with a meditation teacher about it, and she's like, yeah, stop meditating. And, she's been really, really great at helping me through it. And she's given me a lot of practices where she's like, yeah, you need to go outside, you need to like walk, like a lot of grounding practices. And she was like, you aren't vegetarian, are you? And she's like, I'm like, no. She's like, yeah, you need to eat like heavy food, like meat and potatoes,
Yeah.
But, and it's stuff that sounds kind of woo woo. And there's definitely a rational part of me that's like, oh, sounds kind of silly, but this stuff all really helps. I mean, cause it's psychological stuff. It's like, okay, you're getting outside of your head. You're focusing on like real life stuff that has a certain weight to it. But then the other thing that was interesting is, I spoke with my therapist. I started seeing a therapist again. This is actually a therapist that I use for marriage counseling, but I felt like, oh, she feels like the right fit for this. And I spoke with her, and speaking with her, it's like, she was able to help identify this whole other area where I was like, oh, I can see how this other like stress and tension I was creating over here, like made things worse. And I kind of like want to mention this to start out because I think it was really interesting that I had this difficult experience, and it's like approaching it from a viewpoint of meditation and how meditation was affecting it was helpful, but also like approaching it from this other direction of like this kind of more traditional, therapeutic direction was also helpful. And for me, it kind of highlighted this kind of difficulty with depression. That we have this category we call depression that's just for all shitty feelings that last longer than, a week or a day. And the million reasons we could be having those feelings. We kind of all lump it into one thing. But that's one thing that I really appreciate about Hell of Mercy is that part of what it's doing is it's trying to do a little bit of that work of sorting that out, of saying that like there could be a spiritual component. There's also can be like a little bit of there's obviously like a chemical component to it. And lots of other things.
You sort of end up being Rodney King in a way. You're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place sometimes, because I think a lot of spiritual people don't want to hear any impurities entering their practice. It's like, I mean, you were just telling a story about the almost unavoidable intermesh of the real life factors with the meditation factors. And I think that's just realistic, but I think we would so much prefer to have it that they're nice, neat little boxes. My meditation stuff is here, and my problems, troubles, mental illnesses, mental stuff is over here, and if I have depression or I'm bipolar, so I've got the whole spectrum there.
Yeah.
And a lot of people cannot really conceive of the two being entwined, and certainly cannot conceive of how to begin to sort out depression from, we talk about the dark night at Dharma Overground.
Yeah.
From the tougher, darker periods of the meditative path.
Yeah. I can see it as being kind of like, regardless of your viewpoint, there's a temptation to want to have some sort of reductive opinion of it. So you could have this kind of like materialistic, rational DSM-V, whatever view where it's like, oh, depression is this sickness and it needs to be treated. And here are the modalities to treat it. But it's also very, very tempting. And you see this on Dharma Overground all the time. People that are like, there was someone that had a thread that's like, is this only answer to happiness? That there is the spiritual viewpoint of like, yeah, just this thing.
Yeah.
Which makes sense because when you do spiritual practices and you have these incredible, like mind-blowing experiences, it's very easy to say like, this is it. This is the thing, you know, you really want to jump on that.
Well, you do. But you also want to pay the rent and raise your child and keep your marriage together. So, you know, it's like the whole thing, you got to get it right in the big picture, or, I mean, you're not going to be happy if all those things fall apart. So, you know, it's a lot of it is simply we're disciplined by the realities of the world. And the other thing that I've found I had to do it. I mean, I was deep into meditation in my teens, and that was about the time of the onset of my depression too. So, and for a good long time, I could tell myself, oh, I had just awakened to the suffering of the world and stuff. And you can actually go for quite a while on that theory.
Yeah.
There's plenty of misery, you know. And the other thing is it's easy enough to project depression into situations, and you can almost always find something wrong with any situation as well. So you can go for quite a while before even beginning to be completely aware that your depression is self-fulfilling to some extent. And it's at that point, I think, when you turn inward that you start to even have a chance of sorting it out. And I came up before most of the drugs. You know, I had to deal with depression for many, many years where the simplest lithium was sort of like the only thing people really talked about in those days as a treatment, chemical treatment for depression.
Yeah.
And I didn't like lithium at the time. It just made me feel a little bit out of my body, slightly distant. And plus, I had such attitude. I have such attitude. Like I did have the spiritual purity thing. Like, you know, oh no, this is my soul's angst. You know, I had a sort of a romantic thing going.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until quite some time later that I really got myself in a deep enough hole where I was even willing to consider it. And even then, it took a painter friend of mine went on antidepressants. And she called me up one New Year's Eve, and we were just talking. And she said, "Oh man, it's really amazing. I've been depressed all my life, and this new drug actually, you know, lifted my mood quite a bit. And I'm still productive, and I can still, you know, I trusted her artistic process completely because I knew her that well. And that had been one of my fears as a writer, was that, you know, it would fuck me up. It would screw me up.
Yeah.
So, and she was saying no, didn't. So at that point I gave it a try, and my wife at the time, as soon as I said I was going to try it, started crying.
Oh,
because she was so relieved. It was just so evident how depressed I was and how much I needed some kind of help.
Yeah.
You know, I could pray as much as I want and write dark novels as much as I wanted, but I was also clinically depressed at the time.
Yeah.
So it was a mercy to those around me to seek actual psychological, psychiatric help.
Yeah, that's kind of what I found interesting about kind of the arc of Hell of Mercy is that it is kind of mostly you're starting trying to find solutions to this thing spiritually, which I mean I can relate to.
Mm-hmm.
You know, growing up Mormon, of course it looks very different growing up Mormon. Growing up Mormon, it's mostly about beating yourself up because you're kind of have this feeling that you feel like shit because you're not good enough, right? And if you're just like,
yeah, well, we got that in the Catholicism too, has that. So we're brothers in that stuff.
So I didn't really get experience with like the more high level spiritual practice, like with meditation and all that stuff until kind of after learning about depression. And so my arc is a little bit different as far as like, I had that kind of like beat up on yourself thing. And then I had like discovering depression, and then it's like therapy and like, oh yeah, that's therapy. Like there's really something here, and
Yeah.
then discovering meditation for myself later and having a really great benefit from that. So, I think it's interesting because I think
That seems like a much saner order to do it in, to tell you the truth.
I think it
I
is.
did it ass backwards. Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to have a basis of sanity before you go leaping in.
Yeah. And that's not to say that there still isn't work to be done. Actually, it's really great. I read this thing from Ron Crouch the other day. I hadn't found this before, but he's got this great, someone posted this on Dharma Overground, and it's
Mm-hmm.
just like a PDF about his kind of description of the path, progress of insight,
Mm-hmm.
and he just makes this point that other people have made, but the way he made it just was really helpful. It just kind of helped me see this thing. He's just like, yeah, having depression and anxiety and other things it's gonna, when you have negative effects from meditation, it's going to make those things worse, and it's just like, there's just this like interference pattern, right? There's these different waves of
Yeah.
negativity, and it's like, it really helps to address kind of all those things if you can. But I guess I was going to say, I think the interesting thing about Hell of Mercy is that depending on where you are, depending on what your viewpoint is, that it can kind of illuminate that there are multiple possibilities. Like the reason why you're depressed, it could be this spiritual thing, which I think a lot of people actually miss, so it could be helpful
Yeah.
for people to investigate that and be like, okay, maybe this is like a spiritual thing. But I think kind of the real arc of the book is that like, hey, if you need medication, it's okay. It's okay to like do medication if you need to.
Well, yeah, I was actually writing it for cliff jumpers like me, who had just jumped in the deep end without a whole lot of thought, relatively young, and
Yeah.
sort of ignored the psychological side of things to a large extent. And I actually thought, it might save a few lives for people to realize, because it does not at all disqualify or annul anything on the spiritual path. Your meditative work remains pretty much the same.
Yeah.
And but John of the Cross gives several criteria, because they had something they called like black bile or something. It was whatever they had at the time that they called depression,
Yeah.
and humors, horrible humors or whatever it was. And he said his final criterion is that if you can't stay away from meditation, like he basically says, if you can distract yourself and find something else that lightens your mood, go do it.
Interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. And I think it actually makes a ton of sense, because the path itself is dead serious. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like we really are, it's a very, very serious thing. And the farther you go, the more serious it gets. So I sort of like that advice as a first sort for everybody, is like, yeah, if you can go distract yourself, do it, because there are really times where nothing but practice will do.
Yeah.
Nothing but good, hard meditative practice, because you're sick of everything else. Basically, you don't want to live a life that is uh, false, essentially, that is a slave to all the things we tend to be enslaved by. And meditation is the path out of that, or at least the path to acceptance of the conditions of it.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think this is probably not uncommon, and I've heard other people describe it this way, but for me, I really feel like I was cornered into meditation. Like that's what the experience felt like to me.
Yes, yes,
I
yes,
was trying
exactly.
everything else, and I was finally just like, I just got to turn around and just walk right into this.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is, I was talking about this with someone the other day too, is how simplifying it is. Once, like, the initial onset of meditation for some people is like they've already done so much of the work in their head and found all the double binds of life and the
Hmm.
false fronts and the bullshit we feed ourselves. So meditation in its initial onset for a lot of people in that condition is relief. that
Yeah.
they start to find a way to get free of these just absolutely dry ruts in the brain that have been spinning looking for a way out. And the way out was never going to be through more of the same.
Mm-hmm.
More of
Yeah.
the same dry thought or the same achievement oriented thought. It had to be a different kind of thinking, a different kind of mentation.
Yeah. And it can definitely be a relief when you find that. But there is the reality that like the deeper you go, like you have to face, like I've definitely, it's not like you're not going to flinch anymore once you decide. It's like, okay, I want to
Oh
face
my
this
God.
thing.
Oh my God. Yeah. No, it
um,
sucks. It really sucks. You're horrified at what you discover about yourself.
yeah. So I think this is probably, I should probably stop right here and just, this is probably the first time on, even though I've like referenced meditation before on this podcast, I should probably just stop and just make a quick explanation of a little bit of progressive insight for those that are not familiar with it. And the really basic,
This will be good.
okay, let's see how well I do. This is after like, I mean, about like 8 months of trying to understand this stuff myself. But the basic art of the progress of insight is that as you do a particular type of meditation, like insight meditation in particular, right, where you're starting to look at the experience of what it means to be alive. Um, there's a certain degree of suffering that comes from certain qualities that are kind of they're really subtle. They're hard to kind of tease out. And so as you start to investigate those things, you start to get a certain amount of relief, but at a certain point, the path becomes difficult. Oh man, this is already sounding like crap, but anyway, I'm going to keep going. But so you can experience.
Yeah, we're going to scare everybody off. This is good. This is very, very good. We can just tell everybody, run the other direction. Run away from meditation. It's the worst goddamn.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. But at a certain point, it can get difficult. And that's what people, colloquially or traditionally call, or both call the dark night of the soul. Things can get really tough, but the idea is as you kind of keep doing the practice, eventually, whether it's a purification that happens, whether you kind of accept those things and integrate those things, you get to a point where things get better. And that's like a really, really rough, quick explanation of it. But just to give people a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about the progress of insight, it's this kind of progress towards awakening, whatever you want to call it. And it's like a movie, right? It basically, things are good. Then they
Theoretically,
get hard.
theoretically, it's got the 3 or 4 acts.
And it should have
Yeah.
there should be a happy ending at some point,
Well, otherwise, we're never going to be able to sell this shit. It's just like crazy. But I actually, like, I think what happens as you go, there is the initial relief, and there's almost always like a honeymoon period in spirituality when you do start practicing. Because for one thing, it's like a big, broad solution. It's like you sort of believe that you've embraced something that will eventually help you come to terms with everything. That it has the initial appearance of a panacea.
Yeah.
As long as you put in the work and do the thing. And then the deeper you go and the more self-aware you become and the more sensitive to the false notes and the sort of the things that just plain don't work, that are just obvious little suffering traps concocted by the mind or by society, you actually start seeing suffering just about everywhere. And I think that's one of the aspects of the dark night is you've raised your awareness sufficiently to start perceiving the subtler forms of suffering and things that cause suffering. And on the initial wave of becoming aware of these things, which we've generally suppressed because we don't want to know about it, either in our environment or especially in ourselves. My God, how could I be the one making everybody miserable? It must be everybody else or the world or whatever. But we start to see the way we are doing it, and then we try to change the way we are doing it, and we find that the way we are doing it has very deep roots in our psyche. And it's sort of like as we chase the roots of our suffering causing behavior down, it'll scare you. It'll definitely scare you because you start doing the math of like, let's see, it took me about 6 months to get this little teeny insight. And then you start projecting forward and you think, okay, now 25,000 years from now, I may have sufficient, it's like you really do go through this phase of, oh my God, this is going to take eons.
Lifetimes. Yeah.
Yeah, man, because the human psyche is a very tough nut and very complicated.
Yeah.
And our ways of fooling ourselves are so incredibly creative.
Yeah, you definitely take more of the you have the mindset you've expressed before of like, this will be a many lifetimes process. You've kind of like settled into that into that fact.
Well, I do believe in liberation in this lifetime. I just think it's impossible. I mean, basically it is impossible. If you do the math, it's completely impossible. And but the other, then you have these experiences of meditation where it's like, oh, we can do this all in one breath. It's like you have certain conditions, it's like, so you do go back and forth, definitely. And and what's interesting is about a spiritual moment, whatever you want to call it, is the absolute unforeseen quality of them. When you really lighten up after a period of grinding and probably banging your head against the wrong wall or whatever. I mean, if it's a wall, it's the wrong wall in a certain sense. So whatever we're banging our head on, but all of a sudden it's like, it's almost like luck, or you back into it. It happens in spite of you, but all of a sudden it lightens up and you realize, whoa. And then you think, oh shit, it could be like all this all the time, man.
Yeah. And that can be a problem too,
Oh yeah. Then you get completely obnoxious.
And you're like, I did it. This is it. I figured it out.
I did it. Look at me. Yeah, exactly. Look, Mom. Look, Dad. Look, everybody. Hey, I'm enlightened. Woo! Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But life has a way of humbling us.
Yeah.
I have a lot of confidence in the humbling power of life and our friends and loved ones, not to mention total strangers.
It's interesting. One thing I'd be interested what your take on this is, though. But one thing that I've been thinking a lot about in my practice lately, and my teacher's been really helpful with this, has been just like the idea of trusting in the mind. And that's one of the tricky things about meditation is that there's all these levels of judgment that are happening where you're like, okay, my mind is wandering, and I'm just going to accept that my mind is wandering, But then you can be like, oh, my mind is wandering, and I'm not accepting my mind is wandering, and I'm being judgmental that I'm not being accepting that my mind is wandering,
Yeah, totally.
It can be all these like subtle ways.
And down we go.
And down you go.
Yeah, the death spiral. Oh my God.
And getting to this point, and I think this maybe needs to come after you've kind of just got the momentum going with meditation, because when you do start, there does need to be a little more effort when you're starting. But for me, like, I'm at this point right now of like, okay, just trust that the mind knows what it needs to do, instead of trying to grab the wheel, kind of let things happen. I did a sit this morning where it was half an hour of just like the mind wandering, which is not common for me. Usually after about 10 minutes in, things settle. But being able to even approach that with a certain amount of like, let the process unfold as it needs to unfold,
Well, I think one thing we do use up is the effortful stuff. Because it just makes us so miserable, basically.
Yeah.
And so if you have a few experiences of sort of getting blindsided by goodness after like massive efforts to do something exactly the opposite of what just happened, I think you do sort of learn that one of the main things we're trying to do is give up this illusion of control over our minds, or that our minds have to work according to a certain pattern for us to be happy or healthy or any of this stuff. Because the mind is like it's an ecology, man. You cannot screw with it too much or you're going to have vast changes.
Yeah.
And I think we've been trying to civilize, to industrialize our minds. And one thing that comes with meditation is just beginning to enjoy the wilderness of your mind a little bit more again.
Oh, I really like that analogy. I think one way that I think is helpful, if I can go back and add my warning to people, one thing that's a helpful way to describe the pitfalls of meditation that is that really, when you get into it, I've done it enough now that I've really, every drug experience I've ever had with illicit substances, I've experienced with meditation. Like, and you talk
Yeah,
about the wilderness of the mind, that like a lot of these like substances we use, they're really just about like throwing a switch that's already in the mind, and you
yeah,
investigate it.
exactly. It's right there.
It's a wild, crazy place. If you explore around enough, you'll be tripping balls, like I had an
Yeah.
experience. This is when I was posting more a few months ago, where I was literally sitting in my backyard staring up at the sky, and I was just like, whoa, the clouds, man, the clouds. Anyone that would have seen me would have thought that I was just like so high at that moment, but it's like
Yeah, just another stone Mormon hippie.
yeah. But yeah, really, it's this idea you're talking about, how we've tried to like condition and industrialize the mind.
Yeah, I mean, there's the downside of the wilderness analogy, of course, is that the wilderness can kill you.
Yeah, exactly.
There's so many ways to die and get lost in the wilderness, and I think I've tried most of them. I probably have a few left to discover, but
Yeah,
I'm really I'm a much more cautious man these days. Not in terms of like I think it's more humble than cautious. You just realize that the weather of the mind has, especially for someone like me who is, genuinely clinically mentally ill
yeah,
on every scale imaginable, is to integrate that with your practice is a lifelong work. And my mood variability gives me constant grist for the meditation mill, that's for sure.
yeah. You've got a much more perilous landscape that you're traversing, I think, than I certainly deal
Yeah,
with.
hopefully most people don't have to deal with this. Most people, their depression does not have quite the roller coaster quality that mine will take on.
Yeah,
But depression is, sorting it out from the dark night is a real thing. You have to have experiences of both, I guess, beyond a certain point, because at this point in my life, there's a kind of a flavor to actual depression.
hmm.
And one thing about the Dark Knight is you often hear it. It's like in John of the Cross's original formulation. There's an active Dark Knight and a passive Dark Knight, and there's actually one of the. He actually has four when you finally get down to it. Dark Knight of the Spirit, Dark Knight of the Soul. So you can have as many as you want. Probably it's fractal, but
Hmm.
what he says is in the depths of it. It's I'm trying to get at this notion of passivity,
Hmm.
because I think there's a kind of abject quality to depression that is not present when you're properly facing the darkness in a dark night. That depression is simply your body sort of quitting on you somehow, or your mind quitting
Hmm.
on you, whereas the dark night, there is a quality of engagement. Even in the utter passivity of it, there's a quality of engagement that is distinct from depression.
That's interesting.
I don't think I'm conveying this at all, but it is discernible at that level, because I know we always have discussions on Dharma Overground about this stuff, and sometimes different words set different people off, but I know that surrender, passivity, and acceptance and letting go are all sort of in the same ballpark, and different people have different reactions to each of these. And so it's tricky just in terms of how people interpret the words. But there
Yes.
is a act of passivity that I think the Dark Knight ends up teaching us. It's required. It's a required element that somehow you have to be both passive and alert.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. There's some nuance there, as far as like there's this active turning in a direction, right? Or, even letting go as an action, right?
Yeah, or even the directionless. Rumi says something about I was torn from all directions into the directionless, or something like that. And I can sort of relate to that. Um, it's something, there's just some quality. It's almost like it's just interest. Like, I think
Hmm.
depression has no interest, and the Dark Knight has interest. It may have despair and horror and
Yeah.
terror, but I think ultimately the interest is there. Of
Yeah,
course, this
I
is
can
from
see
a
that.
point where I'm not under 10 tons of ocean water right at the moment. So maybe it's like childbirth or something, and it all is glamorized in retrospect. And as soon as you're
Sure.
back in it, you'll be like, I'm never going to have another kid.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's stuff. It's interesting to talk about that stuff abstractly. Then in your middle of it, you're just like, oh shit, I don't want to have to
Yeah,
do
exactly.
this right now.
Let me out of here. Let me out of here.
Yeah,
Let me out of
but
here.
that's one of
I want
those
the
things.
epidural,
Yeah, yeah. That's definitely one of those
the
things
Dark
too, where
Knight
it's like
epidural.
afterwards, at the very least, you can have like I had these recent panic attack experiences, and I can look back at those, and okay, this is me.
Yeah.
This is poetic justice for me, where it's like you get what you ask for. Where I had this A&P
Yeah,
experience
right.
where I was like, I'm supposed to
Right.
have, there's supposed to be a dark night at some point. Where's the dark night? And then over the course of like 3 days, like, it's like, oh, I can now look back at that and see like every single aspect that they describe, like there's the
Yeah.
fear, there's
You
the
asked for it,
misery,
you got it.
there's,
There you
yeah, there's
go.
the desire
Precise
for
as can be.
deliverance.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, now I have my merit badge for that. So
Yeah, sew it on your sleeve. Then your
yeah,
sleeve gets torn off by the next one. It's
yeah,
amazing stuff. It is. But I think it's true that it's much easier to be mellow around the campfire than it is while you're actually in the campfire. It's like the Dark
yeah.
Knight, you're in the fucking fire.
I got to say though, that's also, the other bit of wisdom that's really come home to me is that like that's when you need to make sure that you've got like the right support, that you've got some sort
Yeah.
of like having a teacher, having a therapist, like having my wife, like I was just like crawling on my hands and knees and just like I totally relying on her, and so um
Yeah.
that's one thing that I like from Ron Crouch's thing as well, where he's basically like, once you've been through the rising and passing, you should really contact
Hmm.
someone with experience to start
Like,
consulting, to
get
start
ready.
guiding you
Yeah,
with
get
this.
ready. Start laying your groundwork. And the other thing is to
Yeah.
not leak in the other direction and not, project the Dark Knight onto your environment. That is your support and your basis. And you gotta
Yes.
you gotta contain. You gotta contain because there's a lot of negativity that comes up that is really can be astounding in its intensity.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's things, so in like Mastering Core Teachings of the Buddha, they often call MCTB. They, Daniel will
Yeah,
talk
that's
about like the whole idea of like, you really need to do normal things, like take baths and watch a good movie. And I'm starting to understand that
absolutely.
now, that you talk about the grounding
Yeah,
stuff, and it's more about
yeah,
doing very normal things in the normal world and getting out of your mind,
yeah,
not so much as
yeah,
like, let's do
absolutely.
some nice things to offset the heavy stuff. But yeah, if you
Yeah,
let stuff leak out, then it can disrupt all that stuff that's grounding. Like, you want that place to be a
it
grounding
sure
place.
can.
Like don't
Yeah,
like crap all over it, right?
yeah, absolutely.
Um,
Don't shit in the nest.
so I was actually kind of curious to ask you this. Maybe this goes. We had a chat before. In Hell of Mercy, you definitely talk about spiritual practices. You talk about medication. But in one of our previous chats, you've also talked about just you felt you give a sense that you're getting an ability to better navigate, particularly like your manic episodes.
Well, I think,
And
oh my God, it's horrifying. Yeah,
but I'm kind of curious, what other things for you um, help to bring you down to earth, or are grounding, or help, besides like the medication, besides the practice? Are there other things in life that are kind of you find to be healthy things?
I actually, well, it depends partly on whether we're talking about depression or mania, because they definitely have different. Um,
Yeah.
there are certain grounding things, like being out in nature is always good.
Does that,
Um,
regardless of whether you're in mania or depression?
yeah, because in depression, it just is refreshing and relaxing, and in mania, I can't do any damage. Mania is such a. I'm not even sure we should talk about mania on a public medium. I mean, I'm just like, mania is just crazy, man. And
Yeah.
I have been through my last two rounds of mania. They seem to come every bunch of years, some years between them, thank God.
Oh, really?
And I've
That's
been through the
nice.
last. Yeah, there's a little bit of a break of years, and there are certain things I can do to absolutely avoid it. Like back in my dope smoking days in California, it was like I might as well have been manic the whole time I was in California in a certain way because there was just so much marijuana in the environment, and that
Mm,
always had me at a certain close to manic level, no matter what else.
yeah.
So those days, you know, that's just sanity to not do that kind of stuff. So that's long gone. But unfortunately, I still had a couple of fairly strong ones in the last bunch of years. So I've gotten through two in a row without hospitalization, which I consider, God willing, a learning curve in
Yeah.
that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that just trying to practice during a mania is interesting. And I'm not sure. See, in a certain way, I'm not sure any of this shit does any of this stuff does anybody any good. I mean, if I'm talking, I can talk about it to people who have not experienced mania. But if I'm talking to somebody who's experienced mania, they know very well that it comes down to whether you take antipsychotics or not at the
Yeah.
crunch. And I've been trying to get through them without, and that is actually um, a don't try this at home kind of thing as
Sure.
far as I'm concerned. It's like so I wouldn't advise anybody, first of all, to have my psyche, number one, and number two, to do with the psyche what I tend to do with my psyche. So in that sense, it's not normative in any sense. But I do think that with survival and experience, you do start to learn little things. But I mean, just mania is just an obnoxious state of mind, Brandon. I'm telling you, man, you really don't want to be around me.
Okay. Yeah. I'll take that very
I mean,
seriously. Are you very good? Are you very good though at kind of setting up flags to people to say like, hey, just so you know.
oh, it's so obvious. You can tell from 5 miles away with me.
But just out of curiosity, when did your last mania kind of end?
Um, it depends on how you count. I've got friends who wonder if I'm still manic, but I know I'm not now. But I would
Okay.
say probably toward the end of July.
Okay. Because
So I mean, it was a hell of a roll there.
I definitely remember when we were interacting a little bit more on Dharma Overground early in the year that you were very active on the forum.
Yeah.
You
See,
know.
that's it. Partly, it's just like an extremely high level of activity. Yeah.
Yeah.
And like I say, I'm getting better at trying to keep it within the bounds. But one of the things that mania does is violates boundaries. In
Yeah.
like you're already half a mile past the border before you realize you violated the boundary. It's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So mania is a special case that I have far from mastered. Depression seems more. For one thing, depression is way more socially acceptable and less
Mm,
socially disruptive. So people
sure.
can live with you for a long time if you're depressed, or in a dark night if you just hold your mud. In either case, it's a whole different thing from if you're either manic or talking out loud to God, because, obviously there are certain spiritual states that people, it's notorious how crazy you can be in a high spiritual state.
Yep.
And I think
Yep.
a lot of people have experienced it. You start thinking you've got powers or you're identified with divine energies and all this kind of stuff. And by golly, boy, there
Yeah.
it is. So it's very humbling, but like I say, I wouldn't wish it on anybody. And once you're in it, I think it does help to have some self consciousness, but it's also, boy, man, the human capacity to justify its own behavior is never more evident than when you're in some kind of manic movie telling
Mm,
yourself this is what's going on, and everybody around you is saying, Tim, that's not what's going on.
yeah.
And my capacity to fly in the face of that is appalling, I will say.
Is part of what happens. Sorry, is part of what happens that the awareness kind of gets eroded by the mania. So even the awareness is kind of manic. Is there?
I think what I think mania in that aspect tends to be just acting out of old movies that I have yet to let go of. I'll
Okay.
be starring in the show of my dreams, basically.
Hmm.
And I think on a subtler level, you're going to get that at any level of energization, and
Yeah.
and then you'll run it out, and hopefully become aware of it before you actually, before the thing has wrecked your life.
Yeah.
And I think with Mania, you just your movies get so energized that by the time you realize you're in one, you've got handcuffs on or something, or you're divorced, or you're living in another state. So,
Oh, geez.
well,
Um,
how did I get here? Anyway, you basically want to
that's
work
okay.
on the low side of psychosis. Let's try to keep it on the
Yeah.
earthbound side of psychosis in general in your spiritual path. How about that?
Yeah. No, that sounds good. I mean, I'm just kind of curious. I mean, and this is, I mean, you are kind of apologizing for going into Mania, but it's totally due to my curiosity, since like this isn't, I don't understand that. I get very uncomfortable on like a cup of coffee. So like the high energy states are something that are just like not,
Well, you were raised with coffee is against your religion, man. You weren't you never you probably are
yeah,
like so sensitive to caffeine.
exactly. Yeah. They call it a pharmacological virgin. Yeah. So that, when I stopped being active LDS Mormon probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I went through the traditional let's try all the stuff phase, and everything is like shooting a
Uh-huh.
cannon. It's like I take my first
Yeah,
drink of
it's like
alcohol,
whoa.
and it's like
Right.
it's like I can't. Yeah, I'm basically at this
You're a
point where I've
lightweight,
been
buddy.
Mormon so long. Yeah, I've been Mormon so long that my body is just like, yeah, no, you're not doing any of that stuff.
Yeah.
And
You have a
especially now
Mormon
that
body, it's too late.
it's yeah, especially now with the spiritual practice, it's like mixing those things together is
Yeah.
just too unpredictable. As I have recently expressed it, I had a bad experience recently
Yeah.
with doing some mushrooms, and my mind was just a little bit too loose at that moment to handle it.
Yeah, I think one reason to talk about mania is just to say you don't want to go here. You don't
Yeah.
want to go here through substances, and you don't want to go here through encouraging the states. Like some people glamorize it as an artistic state. Artists are
Oh
manic
yeah.
depressive, artists are crazy, that kind of stuff, and it's not so. It's actually completely disruptive of any kind of real productivity, and it's disruptive of any kind of real inwardness.
Yeah.
Mania is so. It's really a horrifying condition that I just want to learn to not anything I can do to stay out of it, basically. And once I'm in
Yeah.
it, anything I can do to minimize the impact.
Yeah. Do you find on your off phases, however you call it, is there like groundwork you try to lay that you're like, okay, I need to store up
Oh
supplies,
hell
kind of
yeah,
get ready
yeah.
for this?
No, a big part of it is all the things I'm never ever going to do again. There's a long period of review and um, sort of like never again, never again. I go back over. The Catholic conscience is good because I basically am in constant confession for about 6 or 8 months after a
Yeah.
mania, just
Mm.
digesting it all and swearing, feeling the shame and the humiliation and trying to, you know, you do all your do's and don'ts. They all get redone after every
Mm.
mania, and
Mm.
hopefully there's a hope that they get better. I don't know, man. It's so interesting
Yeah.
to me. I do hope there's a learning curve. Otherwise, I
Yeah.
can't see anything to do but lock myself in a basement beyond a certain point.
Yeah. No.
And I
Yeah.
speak that's the spiritual solution is just like a lock. Yeah, here's the fine spiritual wisdom of all the ages is lock yourself in a basement for the next 6 months. That's cheerful. I realize how look, we're way. I'm sorry, I jumped off the deep end, man. I don't know what happened.
No, no, this is actually what I really appreciate about something like Hell of Mercy is that, oh man, it's so easy. It's so easy to just want to give people hope, you know?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I like that Hell of Mercy is just like, look, this is how, and it's glib to say it. Like, I think it's like really doesn't flinch in how it looks at it. But man, I think to be sane, I think hope can make you crazy if it's misplaced hope.
Yeah, I think you got to notice that shit is real. It's like, well,
Yeah.
a black sense of humor, I think, is probably my best survival tool. is that, and I was raised by, my mom was in the theater, and they were capable of just saying how screwed up something was, and my dad was a Marine, and he was certainly capable of
Oh,
saying
geez.
with great humor how screwed up something was. You know, they have all the foobar, and there's a lot of Marine expressions for bad situations that are inherently humorous. So
Yeah.
I come by my black sense of humor very honestly, and I just, for myself, it's just so necessary because, I mean, Buddhism, if you don't have a black sense of humor and you go into a spiritual path where the first noble truth is that existence is suffering, depending on how you translate it, you better bring a black sense of humor to that path, man, or you're going to be miserable.
So one of the things I wanted to ask about you, I wanted to ask you about is, so Hell of Mercy is interesting because it's all kind of really before your career as an artist started too. So it's like you're constantly referring to how shitty your writing is as throughout the course of the book, and
I still do that,
obviously
though.
I mean, I think the book is fantastically written. Just the stuff you write on Dharma Overground, I'm always just like, I'm really just blown away by your inventiveness and how you write. And obviously you know how to construct sentences, which I don't know how to do. But I also just I picked up Slow Work. And so I'm reading through Slow Work. I'm at like chapter 3. And
that's cool. That's fun.
I mean, I really want to read your narrative stuff now. And so you mentioned that that's your favorite thing. So
no, I'm just delighted that you're reading the novels. That's fun.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I looked up your other work and I'm like, okay, I think probably the one you're best known for is probably the monk downstairs, since that's the one.
Yeah, that's the only one that sold at all. That came out in the early aughts. I guess we're starting to call that decade the aughts. And
Yeah.
that actually made a couple little lists and got a couple little things, and uh, it made a splash. And I think I spoiled everybody because it's essentially it's a little bit, it's sort of a romance. I mean, it's a great love story.
Yeah.
I always tell it like a joke.
Well, first of all, it appealed to me because I've always had kind of an obsession with monks, and that's why I have my own comic that's basically about a monk too. But those are all my favorite. All my favorite figures in literature are like I love Brothers Karamazov. I love like Canticle for Leibowitz, Black Robe, like those type of characters have always appealed to me. But then the fact that I picked up, I haven't read it yet, but picking up the description that it is a romance, there's something that was really delightful about that to me.
Yeah, well, the guy basically, not to do a plot spoiler, but the guy leaves the monastery and he's talking about a dark night of the soul. I can't tell if it's a dark night or a loss of, he's just really struggling. And he's also totally fucking pissed off at the monastery situation because they were a little too active for his taste. So I think, and I know a lot of contemplatives struggle with that. If you've ever been in an ashram or a monastery, you know how completely uncontemplative a lot of those places are, what hectic little beehives of activity they are, which is crazy, but the way it is.
Yeah.
And so this guy is, and he's on the down and out, and he ends up renting what's called an in-law apartment in San Francisco from a single mother. And so I always say it's monk meets girl, monk loses girl, monk gets girl back.
Yeah.
But there's some fun. He actually writes some letters during the course of the book that go right to the heart of coming to terms with certain of the darker sides of spirituality. So I try to present it as a holistically balanced thing, but it's really not. It's a love story.
Yeah, and there's something I really love about that. Like there is like a romance of like monasticism, and so it's like the idea that you have that, and then you're just like, yeah, but it's nice to be in love too.
It's got a good thread of grief, though. It's hard for you to find a book by me that doesn't have like a big wad of grief in it somewhere, because I tend to think that I think the spiritual path itself is essentially grief work, because they both culminate in acceptance, and they both go through all these gnarly stages. So I think it's almost the same, that we're somehow accepting mortality, our human condition, all these things, and loss and suffering. So I tend to equate the spiritual path with grief work in a lot of ways, and I find they illuminate each other for sure.
Yeah.
So my novels tend to have, just to keep me honest, have a vein of grief.
you couldn't have made it any more obvious with like slow work. Like there's something
Yeah.
I've just barely started it, but I love the metaphor of like being a mason that creates gravestones. Cause I'm just reading that. I'm just
Yeah.
like that in some ways that really like is a great metaphor for just like what making art is, you know, that it's like,
Absolutely.
what
Plus,
are we really talking about? We're talking about life and death, you know,
yeah.
the
Yeah.
idea of the
Yeah.
excruciating nature of chiseling away stone, how much that is like the process of making art, you know?
Yes, yes. And he learns this craft from his grandfather, and the wisdom of it is you don't want to carve something into stone that you're not doing with love and wisdom,
Yeah.
because you're going to have to look at it 50 years later and you're going to be embarrassed if you did a bad job. So there's that element
Yeah.
too, because he learns from his grandfather, who's a master not just at the carving, but of dealing with people who are in grief.
People. That's a big part of it for me
Yes.
too, is like remembering that art is a relationship. We think of it about so much as a solitary thing, but thinking about it
Yeah.
as like, this is about connecting with other people. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
And I love, they talk about, they walk through the cemetery and he noticing all the fixes. Like when he gets to the point where he can see all the
Yes.
fixes in all the
Yes.
gravestones,
Yes.
I'm just like, okay,
Yes.
that's, I know that experience as an artist. At least I have whiteout. I can at least use whiteout, which is,
Yeah, stonework is a little less forgiving.
but there was one part in particular I wanted to mention that I highlighted that I really liked, and that was it's at the beginning. It's after he has his adventure in California, and thinks he sees God and
Uh-huh.
all this stuff, and then he's finally like, oh,
Yeah,
I'm gonna carve my gravestone, you know, and he's sitting there waiting kind of for
right.
inspiration, I guess, you know,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
finally he finally decides like, oh, okay, I need to start carving, you know, it's not gonna,
yeah.
and it just happens to be the place that I am in life right now. That was just like the perfect thing I needed to
Ah,
hear, because
ah,
I've had my own spiritual thing that's really put me in this tumble cycle of like what am I doing with life and stuff, and I've really been
yeah,
like kind of not wanting to act because I've just been questioning every
yeah,
action,
yeah,
you know, because that's how, you
yeah.
know, the way that meditation will just make you suddenly realize your motivations for doing things.
Yes,
And so
yes, definitely.
I don't trust my motivation for wanting to do this. I don't trust my motivation for wanting to do this. And so I just stopped doing everything. But getting to a
Yeah,
point where I needed to say, I need to act. I need to start carving, and I need to see how like crappy it looks when I
yeah.
try to carve into rock and then move forward.
Well, that's
So
his feedback too. The first letter he tries, he screws up the letter, and then he realizes it's time to go back and really learn his craft.
yes.
So that is a turning point for him too, where it's sobering and humbling, and you realize this is just going to take a lot of work, just solid, applied, discipline, labor, and craft, and that's what it. Then you're home free in a certain way, because right livelihood or right craft, or
Yes.
the right discipline in what you're doing turns that into part of a spiritual practice too.
Yeah. And that, I guess that brings home again that idea that I think all that other stuff is good to like. Here's the thing with kind of like pragmatic dharma, is that
Yes,
it's all about trying to abstract these like elements out from this more complex thing, right? And so it's like, let's just do this
yes,
practice. Let's do this one specific practice. But you talk about like the what is it, the eightfold path? You're referencing like the right livelihood.
right,
All those
yeah,
things are like tied together, right? Like just like
yes,
having a job, paying the bills, being a decent
yeah,
person, you know. Um,
yeah,
that's just been really weighing really heavily on me lately, is just that like the morality aspect of it, like how, I mean, in MCTB, it's, you know, he references and says like, yeah, he references that it's infinite, but then of
yes,
course the rest of the book is this giant tome about the specifics of practice, and what we don't understand is that
right,
the
yeah,
tome that would go along with the practice of morality is
yes,
like, you know, many times longer than that, you know, and how crucial that is to,
yeah. A lot of the guys you find who were very heedless about that stuff early in the path become very humble and sober about it later, like me. I'm
yeah,
I'm a guy who, like, being decent. Get yourself decent, man. It's like, do no harm for starters.
Yeah.
And if you can find
Yeah.
kindness, be kind.
Yeah.
And beyond a certain point, I think it's easy early on to be glamorized by spiritual accomplishments, and you got to put that in quotes.
Mm.
But the farther you go, it seems to me the deeper you go, the more you really do realize that if the fruits of this are compassion, kindness, perspective, a cool head in hot circumstances, all these different things, that's gorgeous, and I think accomplishments or whatever mean so much less, and the morality of it all means so much more as you go along. I mean, not to become a preacher.
No. Sometimes you have to preach. Did you ever see what's the Coen Brothers one? A simple. No. It's about the Jewish guy that's like going through a midlife
Oh yeah,
crisis.
yeah, 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 yeah.
What is the name of
Yes.
that one? Simple Man? No,
Um,
I'm
yeah, I
a
think
good
it is
man.
a simple man.
A Simple Man. I really love that he's like trying to answer all these like existential questions, and he wants to see this rabbi. Remember, it's like this
Yes,
rabbi he's trying to get in to
yes.
see, and the boy finally gets in to see the rabbi, and the rabbi, the wisdom for the boy is just be a good boy. You know,
Yep, yep.
that's about as much as you really need to know. You know.
I know, but think of people like us who, I mean, we've come full circle, right? Because that's what the Catholic
Yeah.
priest would have told me. That's what a Mormon elder would have told you. And yet we had
Yeah.
to go find a contemplative tradition. Neither of those religions is especially
Yeah.
known. I mean, Catholicism does
No.
have it, but I had to dig it. I didn't find Catholic contemplative stuff until I was in the ashram. I was in a Hindu
Yeah.
ashram when I discovered John of the Cross and the Cloud of Unknowing, and you had to, you know, God knows how you found your way to this stuff. So we weren't getting it in our traditions of birth. To us,
Yeah.
being told at that point, be a good boy, meant be a normal little kid, and
Yes.
well behaved and blah blah blah. So I think, in a way, the balancing movement against, yes, the morality stuff, is we had to find our way to what morality actually meant beyond uh,
What you
nice
should do.
behavior.
Yeah.
Exactly. Nice behavior that
Normalized behavior.
doesn't disrupt. Yeah,
Yeah.
normalize crap. I mean, God
Yeah.
bless us all. God bless the normalized crap that keeps the world together. But, you know, certain people are just going to have to go make a whole bunch of mistakes and then come back and say exactly the same thing. Be a nice boy.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point that it really does mean something different. Once you kind of understand, what's really going
Yeah.
on. It's like at the end of the day, and that can take you really really far, and at the end of the day, in the face of all the shit that is the world, like the world can be as horrible as you want, but you can still choose to be kind. Like that's pretty
Yeah.
amazing thing.
Yeah. And those moments are treasures. You start to realize what a treasure human kindness is, the more you see of it. And
Yeah.
it's just, it's a very miraculous thing. Love and
Yeah.
kindness. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm just thinking back about your story when you have your artist friend telling you, yeah, take some drugs. Just those moments when
Yeah.
things are so horrible and whatever it
Yeah.
is, you have a moment in therapy where someone helps you see past something or just a hug from someone that loves, where you really feel loved.
Yeah. It's so precious.
Yeah.
And that goes back to the thing we were talking about too, about how quickly spiritual moments come upon you. These moments come out of nowhere, and all of a sudden, oh wow, it's all different. And it is a moment of kindness too. It's a moment of
Oh yeah.
lightening up. Just it's so instantaneous. It's fascinating how it
Yeah.
changes everything.
That's it's definitely worth like nurturing. So of all the warnings I could give to people about like the path and the things that can happen in the path, like it does also allow you to kind of break out of some real prisons too. So, you know,
Yeah, I think that was, yeah, we don't need to get into our critique of society today.
yeah.
The meditative plan to take over the world and all that. We're gonna keep that on the down low for a while. No, I'm just joking. I hope everybody listening understands. I'm just joking.
I actually have a very hard time knowing exactly what to say to other people. Like, should I recommend it? Should I like, I'm still not totally
I know.
sure, you know?
No, I
Um,
know. It's sort of like a last resort. I think it is a last resort in a certain way. It's like, and it's not getting played that way in the world anymore. It's like it's supposed to be this quick fix for stress and stuff, and it's like, man, I don't know.
Yeah, there's this whole thing
It's
about like teaching mindfulness in school and things like that. And if there was a time when I was like, when I wanted to like teach my kids stuff, and now I'm much more cautious. I'm like, I need to be very careful
yeah,
about like what I teach them. And I mean, maybe like concentration, I'd maybe have them start with some concentration practices, but you
yeah.
know, I'm not going to do any Mahasi style vipassana, you know.
Well, exactly. And I'm not doing any fucking John of the Cross, man. I'll tell you, you want to go down to the bottom, that's fine, but I don't think most people have to go down to the bottom from what I observe of the world.
Yeah,
And the journey to the bottom, there's a lot of ways to get messed up along the way. So I think if
yeah,
well, there's what's that classic? There's a classic saying. I think it might come from Zen. Better not to start, but if you
yes,
start, better to finish.
better to finish. I love that. I mean, there is in general. I do think, if I'm honest, there's a place for it. Like we need to have a place in the world for the
Oh
practice,
hell
for
yeah,
it to be
yes, definitely.
normalized.
No,
Um,
yeah, I think that's true. It would I would have died without it. So, there's
yeah,
no question that it has its place in the world, but I don't think it has this broad, necessarily broad general applicability because I
yeah,
think you're going to get messed up before you get better, and I'm not sure a lot of people are prepared to get as messed up.
yeah.
I'm probably the wrong one to be talking about any of this crap. So, because I'm an extreme case from a lot of different angles.
No, I think you're the best in a lot of ways, because like you do know how things can interact, and how dangerous things can be. Um,
Yeah, and I've tried to be decent.
but I mean, there's this question. This is one thing you kind of imply in the book. Um, you don't go into a lot of detail into, but there is this kind of sense that part of the problem is just that we don't have ways to make sense of depression, whether it is spiritual or chemical, or
Yeah,
that
yeah,
the world that we live in doesn't really have a good box for it. Doesn't have a good box for being an artist. This is one of my things too, is that like
yeah,
the way we make sense of being an artist within our world is really clunky, and that leads to
yeah.
this whole other problems of failure, expectation and failure, and wanting fame and things like this. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. A particular sort of person, particularly in America, is going to find it very, very difficult to find sustenance in the normative culture.
yes, yeah,
It's just not really there. You really got to make your own way without a whole lot of help. I mean, you do end up finding comrades and friends and stuff like that, but the American culture as a whole is almost completely antithetical to any kind of sensitized artistic or spiritual aspirations, basically, which is not the worst thing in the world. God help us, we're a practical country, but all
yeah.
people are not like that,
It's grounded.
and you're going to get yeah, we're grounded as fuck.
Well, I like to say that the problem with America, though, is that we tell ourselves that we're grounded, but then we start doing stuff that's very, very ungrounded, but we describe it as if it's grounded. It's like
Yeah, yeah.
that's
No, we're
a whole other
sometimes a minute.
discussion.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying. We should really
Um,
stay off of politics here.
but this is one of the questions I've been trying to sort out, and I think you might have an interesting answer for this. But as far as there's definitely a connection between like the spiritual and the artistic. I don't know if I've quite put my finger on it, but I do like to think that in general, I think art is a spiritual practice, and it's
Yeah, and
something that
a
I
lot
kind
of
of
artists have believed that.
that's something that I kind of intuit. And that doesn't mean that, and there's so many like consequences from that conclusion that can go all sorts of different places. But I'm interested in kind of what your response is to the idea of, is art a spiritual practice, and like, I don't know, in what way does it overlap or feed into this other stuff that we're doing that's spiritual?
It's interesting. It's almost, I mean, there's a book in that for sure. I
Yeah.
think, like, historically, there's no question that art was a sacred practice, and it was very communally oriented with more common symbols. I'm completely glamorized by if you crawl back like half a mile in some of these caves in Europe and stuff
Oh yeah.
that you could only have gotten through like in total terror. I mean, just imagine the first guy crawling, and then you come to these places where they painted things on the walls. Somebody went to a lot of trouble to do that painting on those walls. You know, somebody was very committed, and I can't imagine doing that without having some kind of spirituality or sense of an encompassing spiritual world. I mean, who crawls into the depths of the earth and
Yeah.
draws pictures on the walls? I mean, that's almost a metaphor for the artistic process to me at
Yeah.
its most immediate and primal. It's just like it is this journey through letting go of the ordinary interpretation of things and coming to a representation of the world that can resonate with your fellows. Although who's going to crawl through that cave? Or you eventually want a more public medium, I guess, is part of what I'm saying. But that crawling through the cave part of it has always appealed to me enormously. And I think for me, it also the Oriental art, a lot of it, the ethic of how they make it. A lot of Japanese art is very contemplative, where they'll get themselves in a proper state for like calligraphy or something before they actually do it, and then the doing of it is quite quick.
Hmm.
You know, because they've been working on their craft so long that they can allow the craft to be held loosely, and then what they do is they get themselves into a contemplative state of mind where they they find a balance and let the action emerge. And there's wonderful old Chinese sculptor story where the guy asks him, you know, how do you do one of these incredible sculptures? He says, I go in the woods for 3 days and I wait until my spirit calms, and then I wait till my spirit gets completely silent, and then I wait till I disappear, and then I go find the right tree and start carving.
Hmm.
So there's a contemplative tradition in Eastern art for sure, and those a lot of Eastern landscapes and stuff from various periods are very spiritual and very suggestive.
Hmm.
Alan Watts did a great study of Eastern art from the Sung and period, where those sort of inked landscapes that are almost nothing but a hint of mountains and a bunch of fog and clouds are just so gorgeous and suggestive.
Yeah.
And then in my own life, um, I was sort of fortunate in coming from a very literary family, so I was grounded in the classics and was a gigantic reader. So
Hmm.
for the step to writing, you know, I already had like so many good models of writing in my own head by the time I actually started writing my stuff. But I started out very zen and weird. I stopped using capital letters for about 5 years and stuff like that. I started out as a poet.
Hmm.
So for me, they were completely entwined, and I had this mad Zen image. And I was also playing off the beats because Dharma Bums and all those Kerouac novels, I loved them. And I loved Allen Ginsberg's poetry and Ferlinghetti and all the beats. So the beats were actually a pretty profound interest on me. And they were they were into their own kind of Zen
Hmm.
for sure. I mean, I think Gary Snyder, it was the most disciplined artist among them, but they all had their different takes on Zen, and they were hanging out with Suzuki in New York and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So I have been most interested in art that is entwined with some kind of spiritual thread. And then my job as a novelist has been to not become saccharine and become just like, yeah, you know, because I think I find a lot of times trying to work spirituality into fiction in particular is just yucky. I just don't like the way it's done. So
Huh.
I've tried to do it with a different I have a very different touch on my spirituality, I guess, in novels. I don't know, sometimes I'm in your face, I guess, but I really try to do it. I try to do it with at least a lot of humor and a certain profanity.
Yeah. That always helps,
Like
you
in
know.
my novels, you'll find fucking spirituality in my novels, you know.
No, there's some nice moments of that. So I think I just remembered. I think
one of the phrases that I just read in Slow Work, where it's like the riff on that phrase from Casablanca, or like of all the all the funeral places
I think
in
he
the
says
world.
all the gravestone shops.
Just
Yeah.
that in mind. Yeah, that was nice. That was a nice moment.
Yeah, I definitely try to keep the humor leavening the whole thing.
Yeah.
And this guy is such a dedicated guy. I mean, in my later stuff, like I can just goof and riff. Like California, the Book of the Dead was the first novel I got punished. That was almost a satire of New Age spirituality in a way, but it was also a baby in the bathwater book, because I really did feel that this was an awakening for several generations of American kids who were looking for meaning and looking for religio spiritual stuff, and that despite all the hoopla and nonsense, that there was a genuine there was a baby in all that bathwater. Basically, there
Sure.
was a steak with all that sizzle, and I tried to show that too. Several of the characters have a genuine deep spirituality in that book, and they contrast with the frothy stuff. But unfortunately, New Age people don't like satire, and non-New Age people don't like New Age.
New Age.
So really, the book had no readers. Yeah, basically, it had zero readership. But it was brilliant. I will tell everybody who's never going to read it that it was fucking brilliant.
I'll check it out. Yeah, apparently people are
don't do it. Don't do it. Yeah, read that as the last possible Farrington book. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, okay. That's that'll be useful.
Yeah, that'll help.
This just popping into my head. I don't know if have you ever read I don't know if you've ever read the book Backslider, have you? You familiar with that book?
I don't think so, no.
It's a book about it's a fantastic book. It's like kind of considered for like intellectual like Mormons. It's kind of like the Catcher in Their Eye in Mormondom. Like it's only
cool.
intellectual
Wow.
Mormons that read it. It's about a Mormon cowboy in the 60s that's just like beats up on himself. I'd be interested in your response to it. It's a fairly easy read, but it's
I'm writing it down. Backslider.
Okay. You should check it out. It's got some great like contemplative stuff in it. The ending is like one of my favorite endings in any book ever.
Oh, cool.
But
very cool. All right.
I don't know why that popped in my head. But you're talking about books people
we're talking about spiritual fiction. Fiction.
It made me think about just like books that have these niches that are just these really tiny niches. It's like most Mormons don't want to investigate their Mormondom, and most people that aren't Mormon,
let's not rock the boat.
Most people that aren't Mormon want to read books about Mormons. So,
yeah, exactly.
Well, anyway, man, I think we covered some really cool topics. There's a bunch of other things I'd love to chat with you about, but should probably let you go.
We can do volume 2 in a couple of years.
Let's do volume 2. I want to get it in before the next, wave, whatever the next, manic phase hits. Or, I don't know, maybe better to do it.
Yeah, God help me. I think we got several years there.
Okay, good.
I'm going to just crawl around the ground in penance or something for a couple of years, so that'll help.
All right, Tim. Hey, this is the time.
All right, Brandon, you egged me on, man. You egged me on. I got to say, you totally egged me on in the Mania stuff. So.
Oh, you mean?
And I'm grateful for that.
You mean during on the forums or
during the conversation today? I was like, how did I get into this?
Oh,
and
sure.
then I realized you actually were interested. So I blame you.
I think I hope, and you talked about you might want to write about it at some point. I think that would be like super interesting.
Yeah, I really do think there's a helpful book in there, but it's mostly humility. The more I think about it, especially post-manic, the more I think, God help us all. I mean, I really. Well, like we say, it's another whole book. We'll just have to keep talking for years.
Yeah, cool. All right.
All right, brother. This was fun. This was totally fun. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. You've been listening to How to Be an Artist. To support this podcast, you can go to patreon.com/H2BNA.